Most people believe they are being careful with money. They consistently choose the lowest price available, and that choice feels rational in the moment. A lower price feels like reduced risk. It removes the need to think too deeply about trade-offs, and it creates a sense of immediate control over spending. But there is a hidden pattern behind these decisions. Cheaper things often have shorter time horizons, and they tend to fail when you least expect it. When this cycle repeats, the cost begins to compound. Small purchases quietly stack over time, and the total becomes larger than expected. This is not about spending more or less. It is about understanding the full cost over the long term, because cheap decisions can carry hidden drawdowns. Look at your everyday decisions. The items you choose and the versions you pick often feel small, but over time, these choices quietly shape your financial path. Most of the time, there are two options. One is cheaper, the other slightly more expensive. The difference feels small in the moment, and almost automatically, you lean toward the cheaper one. It feels logical and responsible, like you are reducing risk in the short term. There is nothing wrong with that instinct. It is a normal response, especially when money feels tight. Your brain is optimizing for immediate stability. The problem appears later. Not when you buy, but when you start using it. That is where the hidden cost begins to show. The product wears out faster than expected. Performance is inconsistent and sometimes frustrating. Its time horizon is shorter than you assumed. At that point, it does not feel like a mistake. You simply replace it and move on. The cycle continues without much thought. Because each purchase is small, you rarely track the total. There is no clear sense of accumulation. Volatility hides inside repetition. This is the core illusion. You feel like you are saving money, but over the long term, you are paying more. Imagine buying a cheap pair of shoes. It costs half the price of a better one. It feels like a rational decision in the moment. But after a few months, the shoes begin to break down. The sole wears out faster than expected. Replacement becomes unavoidable. So you buy another pair. You use the same reasoning again. Saving money still feels like the goal. A year passes without much notice. You have bought 2 or 3 pairs already. The total quietly becomes larger than expected. But it never feels expensive in real time. Each purchase seems small and manageable. You only notice the price per transaction. And this pattern is not limited to shoes. It shows up in many daily decisions, often in places you barely notice. Cheap food that does not satisfy you, tools that slow your work down, small choices that quietly take more time. And that is where it becomes expensive, because you never fully measure it, but you feel the impact over the long term. And that is where it becomes expensive, because you never fully measure it, but you feel the impact over the long term. The problem is not the price itself. The problem is how we interpret that price in the moment. We focus only on the number in front of us, not the full picture. We rarely think about what happens after the purchase. How long it lasts is often ignored. Replacement frequency is not part of the decision. Time and energy are also part of the cost. But they are invisible in most transactions. They never show up on a receipt. The system is designed to encourage this behavior. Everything is optimized to feel fast and affordable, so the decision feels easy and harmless. But what feels light at the beginning often becomes heavier later. The cost just arrives in a delayed form, and that delay hides the true impact. This is the psychological trap at play. We avoid a large upfront cost by accepting smaller repeated ones. Because the cost repeats, it compounds quietly. Over a longer time horizon, it becomes significant, often higher than the original alternative. This is not just individual behavior. It is part of a broader system design, and most people simply follow the default path. And this leads to a quiet realization. Cheap is not always efficient in the long term, and expensive is not always wasteful. To understand this clearly, you need a different way of thinking. Looking at price alone hides most of the story. What matters is everything that happens after you pay. We call this the true cost lens. It is a simple way to see what you are actually paying. Not just today, but over time. The first layer is upfront cost. This is the number you see immediately. It feels simple and easy to compare. The second layer is repeat cost. This is how often you need to buy again. Cheap choices often repeat more than expected. The third layer is time cost. Time is lost every time something fails or needs replacing, and time does not come back. The fourth layer is energy cost. Stress and effort build quietly over time. You feel it, even if you do not track it. These four layers form the total cost. Not just a number, but a system. A system that compounds over time. Cheap options usually win the first layer, but they often lose in time horizon and long-term impact. The trade-off becomes visible later. This is where perception shifts. What looked efficient now shows hidden drawdown. Cheap is no longer cheap. Now imagine two people facing the exact same situation. They earn similar income and live in the same environment, but their decisions follow very different patterns. One consistently chooses the cheapest option available. The other pauses to consider total cost over time. Not expensive, just more deliberate. In the short term, the cheaper choice feels efficient. It reduces immediate spending and looks rational. The numbers seem smaller at first glance, but over a longer time horizon, a different pattern emerges. The same purchase repeats more frequently. What looked efficient begins to compound differently. More time is spent replacing what fails. More energy goes into fixing small disruptions. The result becomes less stable over time. Meanwhile, the second person spends slightly more upfront. The decision feels heavier at the beginning, but it reduces the need to repeat. Fewer decisions are required over time. There are fewer interruptions to daily life. Consistency begins to replace volatility, and over time the total cost quietly shifts. The higher upfront choice becomes more efficient. Without feeling dramatic, the math changes direction. This is the real distinction most people miss. It is not about being frugal or wasteful. It is about short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. The solution is not always buying the expensive option. It is also not about avoiding cheap choices entirely. It starts with understanding context and trade-offs. Ask one simple question before deciding. How long will this actually last over time? And how often will you need to replace it? Price is only the surface layer of a decision. Frequency of use quietly shapes the real outcome. Time becomes the hidden variable that compounds. For things you use every single day, the impact multiplies quickly. Small inefficiencies repeat and create friction over time. This is where volatility in outcomes begins to show. This is not about absolute numbers or labels. It is about patterns of behavior and usage, and the consequences that quietly follow them. This is not about absolute numbers or labels. It is about patterns of behavior and usage, and the consequences that quietly follow them. Over time, your perspective begins to shift. You stop focusing only on saving money up front, and start thinking in terms of long-term optimization. You are no longer chasing the lowest price. You are reducing long-term cost across your time horizon. That is where real efficiency starts to emerge. This is what real efficiency looks like in practice. It is not obvious at the beginning of the decision, but it becomes clear after the compounding effect plays out. Many people believe they are making smart decisions by always choosing the cheapest option. It feels efficient in the moment and reduces immediate financial pressure. But in reality, they are often just delaying the real cost. Costs rarely disappear, they simply move across your time horizon. What seems small today can expand through repetition and replacement. Over time, the total impact becomes harder to ignore. This is not about choosing luxury or spending more. It is about understanding trade-offs and hidden risks. The goal is awareness, not consumption. Every decision carries consequences, even when they are not visible immediately. Some costs show up later as time, stress, or inconvenience. These hidden factors often create the biggest drawdown. The most expensive costs are often the ones that are never measured. They hide in lost time and repeated effort. Because they are invisible, they rarely get optimized. Once you start noticing this pattern, your decisions begin to change. You become less reactive to price and more aware of long-term value. This reduces volatility in your daily choices. Low prices stop being automatically attractive. You begin to question the total cost instead of the upfront number. That shift changes your entire decision framework. Small adjustments begin to compound over time. You do not need extreme changes to improve your system. Consistency quietly builds efficiency. Margin is not created from one perfect decision. It comes from repeated patterns that reduce unnecessary loss. Over the long term, that is what creates stability. You are not wrong for choosing the cheapest option. You are optimizing for immediate cost, not long-term impact. Most people operate this way without realizing the hidden trade-offs over time. Cheap does not always mean bad, and expensive does not always mean better. The real variable is context, including usage, durability, and time horizon. Without context, price alone is just noise. When you start measuring total cost, your perspective begins to shift. You begin to see patterns like repetition, maintenance, and hidden time loss. This is where compounding quietly changes the outcome. Small changes in decisions rarely feel important at first, but over a long-term horizon, they accumulate into meaningful differences. What feels minor today can shape your financial volatility over time. If you want to understand money differently, start with how decisions repeat over time. The margin focuses on patterns, not quick wins or shortcuts, because the long term is built from what you repeat, not what you intend.